Good morning. I'm talking to Dr. Claude A. Clegg III, who is the author of The Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. Dr. Clegg, how are you this morning?
I'm great, and I hope that you are too.
Yeah, I'm doing good. How much power does a US president have? Does he have less or more power than people usually assume?
Much less. In some ways, I think that people tend to confuse the branches and the power that the three branches have. That is, I imagine that many people think that the president has more power when it comes to legislation and passing bills and getting policy done than they actually do. You know, certainly they can suggest things to the Congress and their allies or their party members in the Congress. But it's the Congress that actually writes the bills. It's the Congress that actually has to vote. The president, of course, can have an indirect influence by threatening vetoes and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, the president can submit a budget, which they do every year, and it's a wish list of things they'd like to see done. But other than that, it's at best a sort of indirect pressure that they can apply in regard to policy. They have much more influence when it comes to foreign affairs. Some would say too much influence in terms of waging war, sending troops abroad. We've had since Vietnam, a number of undeclared wars. The Vietnam War, there was no, official declaration of war against North Vietnam. The same was the case with the Iraq War. You have, some authorization, quote unquote, from Congress, but no declaration of war, and it's usually the president taking the lead, and it's open-ended in ways that should make us all nervous in regard to the kind of war powers that they exercise. So I think that people can see that, the war powers, and they can see how presidents can direct that and in making treaties, well, not necessarily treaties, but agreements and pacts and things like that with foreign powers. So presidents have a good amount of power there, and again, some would say too much. But in regard to policy and legislation and so forth, again, at best, they can place indirect pressure on the Congress with the veto threat and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of part of the story that emerges in your book about Obama, where there was a lot of frustration voiced from some places, and Obama's presidency was characterized by being hamstrung in a lot of ways, by not having a lot of power to legislate. A president is also a figurehead in America. What kind of a figurehead was President Obama?
Yeah, I think that being his presidency was historic. It was a historic presidency in terms of him being the first African-American person of African descent, person of color to sit in that office, and it was 2 terms. So he was elected with a pretty convincing margin in both the Electoral College vote and the popular vote in 2008 and in 2012 by margins that we just don't see nowadays. Comfortable margins, especially in 2008. I think that as a sort of symbol, an American symbol in the Oval Office, I think he's unique because of that. He's the first person who is not a white guy who was in that office. And again, he's there for 8 years. So there's a whole generation of American young folks who came of age, and there was a Black first family. So I think that symbolism, I don't think we fully comprehended that. I think maybe when some of the folks who were born between 2008 and 2000, or came of age between 2008 and 2016, 2017, once they start telling their stories and once they start giving their impressions, and we have a better sense of what they thought about that period of time, we'll have a sense about the importance. But I think that we haven't fully digested the importance of having a Black president for 8 years and how that has shaped a whole generation, the political consciousness, the political culture of a whole generation of Americans. I think that also his presidency, and you can say this about a lot of different presidencies as well, is pivotal in showing it's a metaphor for what's going on in the larger political culture. It's a metaphor for what's going on in regard to demographic shifts in this country and backlash against those demographic shifts. It's a metaphor or a window into bipartisanship or the lack thereof, or the sort of hyper partisanship that we're seeing in the country. It's a metaphor
or
for
racism.
Yeah, I think it's a metaphor for race and how the country has become more polarized. And again, back to the demographic shifts, this sort of the browning of America, the fact that we're becoming a much more diverse country. And then there's a very clear backlash. The whole presidency of Donald Trump is largely a backlash against Obama. He's self-consciously the anti-Obama. And about half the people in this country were ready for that in 2016 and voted for Trump. So I think as a symbol, he's a complicated symbol that is Obama in that office.
Yeah, reading the book, or in my case, listening to the book, was an intense experience because it's the story very much of my political awakening. I grew up in a very comfortable suburban white area, and politics was like never really on my mind, in those years. I was like, this is my high school, college years, and mostly college, let's say. And it was easy, like not having to worry about politics so much because he was obviously such a from my perspective, he felt like such a competent president. That's what he felt like. And I wasn't worried about tax policy. I wasn't worried about even politics of race so much at the time. And then we sort of moved into the backlash. Where I saw the emergence of right-wing populist candidates, Trump, but also other candidates as well, not just Trump, towards the end of of his second term. And all of a sudden there was this deep sense of like what's possible in politics and why politics maybe matters to some extent. And some of my memories of the Obama presidency that stuck with me the most are his responses to tragedies. So like the Sandy Hook shooting, for example, and the Charleston church shooting, and just the relief of having someone with so much eloquence, someone in that position with so much eloquence and grace and intelligence, which is something which I can no longer take for granted.
Yeah, and I think you put, you set that up in a very eloquent way in regard to your own experiences and how Obama sort of figures in your own coming of age politically. I think that one thing the book tries to do is put Obama into his historical context. So of course it's his life and his presidency, but it's bookended by the Bush administration, and Obama is possible because of a George Bush administration that sort of crashes and burns towards the end in 2008 when we're in 2 wars by then, and neither one of them is going well. The economy slips into what we now call the Great Recession by the end of the Bush years. And Bush himself, I don't think he's going to go down as one of the great presidents for all kinds of reasons. And then those, the economic situation that he's the steward of at the end of his term, and also the wars that we're in are part of the reason that he's not going to, I think, be remembered very well in the rankings of presidents. Then on the other side, the other bookend is, of course, Trump, who is a one-term president. And you have to really, do some things wrong to get limited to 1 term, and that's not very common in the post-war era. Those presidents who run for a second term tend to get a second term in the White House. So in that regard, Obama is even, he's even more of a striking figure in American political culture because he's bookended by these 2 guys who I don't think are going to be remembered very fondly when it comes to historians reflecting back on their presidencies. And that Obama's presidency, I think you're right, it was relatively scandal-free. This was a competent, serious, cerebral guy in the office who took the office seriously. He filled the office of the presidency, and nothing, there were certainly some ups and downs. I think he inherited the recession, and it was a slow grinding recovery out of it. And then there's some incomplete policy things that remained incomplete during his time in office. But in regard to his presence in the office in regard to his management of the office, taking seriously the office and so forth. And then looking at those bookends, Bush and Trump, I think that, yeah, this is a guy who made political oratory, and eloquence popular again. This is a guy who read books. This is a guy who wrote books. A college professor. This is a guy who, again, there were those who were itching to impeach him on the other side, and they simply did not have the fodder to credibly impeach this guy, which they would have loved to have done. So I think it's one of the takeaways, that this was a serious, smart, empathetic, I'd say,
Right.
A decent man in this office for 8 years under some incredible stresses and expectations that were way too high for him or anybody else in that office.
Yeah. I was going to also point out that the empathy component there. There's a lot to talk about. I have a lot of things I want to touch upon. Certainly the backlash to Obama is a big question that I hope we get a chance to touch upon a little bit. And it also affects me personally, because Lord knows I have Trump supporters in my family. But before we get to that question, just to focus on the character of Obama some more, and his biography some more. He was characterized by an optimism, this indomitable optimism about America. There's a part of your book where he's talking, I think in the aftermath of the what was the name, Shelby versus Holder. Shelby versus Holder. And he's talking to civil rights leaders, and he talks about how the previous generations had it worse. At the same time, reading the book is an intense experience for me, and I assume for a lot of people, because it seems to also plot out the grinding to almost a halt of our democratic system. So how do we think about Obama's optimism? Is that optimism accurate, like a helpful representation of our current reality, or is it a little bit out of touch in some ways?
I think the whole promise, Amakai, of the Obama presidency is the optimism. It's the hope and change, right? It's the yes we can mantra. I think, and the whole promise is that we're going to get beyond, as much as we can, race. He was under no impression that we're going to be in this post-racial nirvana. And he actually said that his election did not represent that. But I do think that he thought that we would be able to get to a post-partisan place. That is, in the midst of this economic freefall catastrophe, Republicans and Democrats would put aside their ideological policy differences, and they pull together to pull this country out of the worst economic cataclysm that we'd had since the 1940s and 1930s with the Great Depression. So I did think that he thought that that he could be a transformative president, and that he could bring the sides together, Republicans and Democrats, and that true patriots, he assumed that Republicans were patriots, and as well as his side, the Democrats. True patriots would put aside their bickering and their ideological commitments and their policy commitments, and they pull together, pull from the center and pull the country out of this. He was not right in that. I think that he came to realize, some would say too late, that the other side, the Republicans, were not interested in pulling with him, and that what Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, said, that we want to make this guy a one-term president, was actually the Republican playbook. That is, we were going to oppose him on everything, and even oppose him on, like you said, the government almost grinds to a halt. So they're opposing him on raising the debt ceiling and paying the bills, just the basic functioning of government. But the optimism is a lingering optimism. I think that is something that we see in presidents past. If you can think back to Lincoln, and he's at Gettysburg after that horrific few days there, in terms of the Battle of Gettysburg, he goes there and gives that address, which I think is probably right at the top of presidential oratory. And he says that there's going to be this new awakening of freedom, and that government for the people, by the people, of the people, shall not perish from this earth. You know, and he would live barely to the end of this war before he got assassinated himself. But the optimism, the same with FDR in the midst of the Great Depression. You know, nothing to fear but fear itself. Reagan on the other side, a Republican. Optimism. He's an actor, and he's good at what he does as an actor. But I think that serves him well as a president, in the sort of optimism he projects in the struggle against the Soviet Union and the Cold War and so forth. And to a certain extent, maybe Clinton too. But I think the truly memorable great presidents are optimistic people. They're the country's #1 cheerleader, and they take that seriously. Even in the midst of crisis, in the darkest hours and so forth, you have to have a head of state or a chief executive who tries to elicit the best in people and to bring out the best in their countrymen and countrywomen. And Obama understood that. He studied presidents past. So I think the optimism is baked in the cake for him, but also I think he was very self-consciously aware that this office, this chief executive office, has to be one that's pointing the way forward. People are going to look to him, you know, for inspiration, and they're going to blame him when things go sideways.
Yeah, yeah. Even before the presidency of Trump, a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle, I think, express cynicism about politics. This idea that, you know, it's a show in some ways, or that politicians are corrupt, and, you know, are power hungry. They don't really make our lives better. How do you think about that cynicism? Where does that come from? And what is maybe the response to that kind of cynicism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that some of the cynicism is indeed justifiable easily. I think a lot of folks on both sides of all sides of the political spectrum, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Green Party folks or whoever, I think most would concede there's way too much money in our politics, unaccounted for dark money. As people can just dump money into buy candidates, and you don't know who's buying the candidate nowadays, and who the candidate is beholden to. So people are cynical about that. You know, if you know, corporation A or rich individual B can buy a candidate, what difference does my vote make? You know, when the candidate is already beholden to these interests that aren't being accounted for. I think the way the system operates makes people cynical as well, whether it's the use and abuse of the filibuster in the Senate, whether it's gerrymandering, how district lines get drawn so that politicians are more or less picking their voters as opposed to voters picking their elected leaders. That makes people cynical. I think the nature of the two-party system too, it's either or. You know, you're voting for these guys over here on the left or the center left, or you're voting for these guys here on the right. And that's it. You know, you can go and vote for the libertarians if you want to, or you want to vote for the green people. Well, then, you know, in some instances that might shift an election in a particular state, but more or less shift the election to the Republican or the Democratic candidate. You don't have a green candidate or the Libertarians or the Constitutional Party candidate winning or anything like that. So it's either or. And I think that makes people cynical. That is, that, you know, you have two choices. And there's a lot of people, those choices are not ideal. That is, they might agree with some of what this side is saying, but don't agree with a lot of what they're saying. And they agree with even less on this side. So which one do you pick? You pick the devil that you know, or these folks? You know, so I think that some people vote by not voting. They vote by staying home. I don't like either party. Neither one of them speaks to me. And I just have these two flavors and nothing in between. So I think that's going on in regard to the cynicism. And I think that people don't tend to recognize good management, good administration. but they sure do recognize bad management, and they will criticize and point out bad management and bad leadership. And I think it's the case that in the 21st century, I think people are noticing the things that are broken about the system, whether it's the electoral college and how the guy who didn't win the popular vote can become president. And I don't think a lot of people knew that until it happened in 2000 and 2016. I think, again, the money in the system, the gerrymandered districts, the fact that you just have these two parties to choose between. And as you were saying in regard to your own experience, I don't think people notice just the everyday operation of politics until something terrible happens. Then they notice. Then you have a Tea Party or an Occupy Wall Street or a Trump coming out of nowhere and becoming president. People notice when things aren't well. But otherwise, I don't know if people paying attention. And when they pay attention, they often don't like what they're seeing in regard to American politics of today.
Yeah, and one of my memories of President Obama is him, speaking to large audiences, often audiences of young people, and trying to really motivate them, and saying that your cynicism is valid, but you still have to participate. That there are all these problems like that we just mentioned and talked about, but if you don't participate, it's worse, and it gets worse. And I think that's a really important point. One of the things I learned from your book that was very interesting to me, and regarding his the biography of President Obama, is the way in which his growing up without a father affected his messaging from the White House, and the way he spoke about race in a way that often that sometimes upset a lot of people. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the missing father figure is a through line with his life, Obama's. And as you know, he was born in Hawaii. His parents were students at the University of Hawaii, and they married. It was a brief, unhappy marriage, and it broke up very quickly. His father went on to Harvard, left the family behind in the Pacific, and he eventually goes back to Kenya and moves around, and he dies in a car accident in the 80s. So he met his father once at age 10. His father came back to Hawaii to visit during a Christmas holiday, and that was it. He never saw the man again in life. Even when he learned of his father's death, he said he was kind of not moved by it. He didn't know the man. His father was an abstract thing. The idea of father was an abstraction to him. He did not know his father. And he carries that. He carries it in different ways, though. I think that on the one hand, he felt connected to the father, not just because they share the same name, but I think some of the father's ambition rubs off on the son. And I think the mother's ambition, she sort of travels around the Pacific Ocean and various sorts of research sites. She gets a PhD in anthropology and so forth. So they have this wanderlust, this restlessness. Obama would call it chronic restlessness that he has, and I think he inherits that from his father and from his mother. But the father's a missing figure, and he's raised by his maternal grandparents in Hawaii, and his grandfather kind of steps into that role. On the mainland, when he comes to the States, he after goes to school in the Northeast, he settles in Chicago. He has a spiritual mentor in his church, Jeremiah Wright, who would be problematic for a number of reasons later, but he's kind of a spiritual father figure. Obama is really good at surrounding himself with advisors and mentors. He's not one who shies away from asking advice from people. So he tries to fill that void, but it's never really filled. One of the things he promises himself when he becomes a father is that he's going to try to figure out what that means to be a father, a good father and a good husband and a good steward of the family and so forth. Although his own father, and to a certain degree, his own mother, did not really serve as really good models of parenting. But he was going to try to figure this out. And I think in a very serious way he's going to try to figure it out. And also, he is not averse to giving parental advice to others, including Black men. And he gets into a bit of, some rough patches with some critics who think he's going a bit too far in taking Black men to task about being fathers, or about how they dress, or how they present themselves in public, and so forth. People were saying that he's scolding Black people. He's pulling out the dirty laundry,
or blaming the victim.
He's victim blaming and so forth. And Obama's retort was that, hey, I live this. I know what it means not to have a father in the house. I grew up like that. And if anyone, has the right to say how important it is for guys who have children to be fathers and to be present, I, as a person who experienced not having a father president, have the right to do that. And even with the biggest megaphone in the world, as president of the United States, I have every right to say that in the megaphone, that it's important for fathers to take their job seriously, and for African-American fathers to take their job seriously. There are those who read that as a sort of messaging to white constituents and saying, more or less, this is how some read it. Okay, Obama is saying to white people, oh, I will take to task my own group, and I will publicly scold them and take them to task. So obviously, I'm not going to come in and have this Black agenda and get too cozy with Black people. Look, I'm taking them to task publicly, and so forth on these cultural issues. I don't think that that's incorrect reading of what was going on, but I see both sides of it. I think that Obama was saying some things about fatherhood that were true. That is, in regard to responsibility, in regard to raising families and so forth, and in regard to his own experience, not having that, being raised by his maternal grandparents. So he had a right to say, this is how I was affected by not having a father in my household. And this is what I'm going to do to be a good father. And this is what others, I would suggest do to be good fathers. I think he has every right to say that, but I also see the other side. Okay, you're taking to task Black people, Black men in public in this kind of carping, scolding way, that you're not taking to task other folks. You're not taking to task, white people who get addicted to opioids and looking at that as a moral failing.
Right.
And you're not taking to task, other groups for moral failings in the way that you're doing in regard to Black men and fatherhood. So I can see both sides of the argument there, but he never stopped doing it. He, throughout his presidency, he would still come back to this theme of responsible fatherhood.
Yeah, it's a trope which is often weaponized for very nefarious, poisonous means. It's a way of distracting from real, policy options that could really better the lives of millions of people. And you just say, we don't need policy changes that will make people's lives better because it's their fault, that kind of a thing. And a major theme of the book, a thread that carries, throughout, that's fascinating, is the way in which the former president, was so hamstrung when it comes to talking about race. You talk about in his first term, somewhere in my notes, I have this written down, but it'll take, I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm going to just do it from memory. He said such an innocuous comment in his first term about, I think, a man who was killed by police in his own house, if I remember correctly, or some incident like that. And his poll numbers among whites fell below 50% and never recovered. And his statement was along the lines of we all know that, Black people have, run-ins with police, that are often dangerous, kind of a thing. And sort of that may be haunting his presidency in a way, sort of teaching him about what he can and can't say. And then finally in his second term, maybe sort of being more open and being more forthcoming. And famously, what we all remember is what he said about Trayvon Martin. If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. So can you speak to that about how Obama tried and maybe failed at times to talk about race?
Yes, great question. It is one of the through lines of the book, and I think one of the through lines, the core themes of his public life and life as a public official. So Obama's he learned early that he wanted to be a politician that just happens to be African American as opposed to an African American politician. And there, there's a distinction between the two that's not just semantic. So he always wanted to make himself palatable to a wider constituency beyond African Americans, although he understood that when he ran for office, for example, his first run for office was as a state senator in Illinois, representing Chicago, that you have to have a core constituency of Black voters, but that if you were going to go beyond that, that would not be sufficient. So when he runs for the Illinois Senate or the U.S. Senate, or U.S. Senator from Illinois in 2004, Illinois is primarily a white state. It's not enough to get Black people in Chicago to vote for you. You have to go, to Springfield and all these other places and build a coalition of voters, which he understood, that most of those voters who would be voting for him and voting in that election would be white voters. So he sold himself as more or less a liberal Democrat politician who just happens to also be a Black guy, as opposed to a Black politician. And my core constituency and my agenda is going to be focused on this particular demographic and so forth. So as he runs for the Illinois Senate or the U.S. Senate, representing Illinois in 2004, and then he runs for president, that's his stance. That is his political crouch, so to speak. And that means you don't deal with race unless you absolutely have to in regard to public discourse. If the goal is to appeal to a wide cross section of the electorate, then, and again, if the point is to make people feel optimistic about the future, the quickest way to put a damper on all of that is to get bogged down in conversations about race and racial inequalities and so forth. He would, if he had to, he would address those things, but he addressed them very quickly and set them aside as quickly as he could. So if he had to address some instance involving race, he would take it head on, and then as quickly as he could, put it aside, and then address these sort of universalist issues that voters might be concerned about, such as education or healthcare and so forth. And his presidency is more or less like that too. If he's forced to deal with race, for example, in the primaries in 2008, before he becomes president, it comes to pass, or it becomes known that his minister, Jeremiah Wright, who was a minister of a Chicago church, had said some pretty intemperate things about the country in some of his sermons in regard to American foreign policy. Racism has been endemic to the country, and racial prejudice and so forth. And his opponents in the primaries would want to pin that on him, this minister and his screeds, his pronouncements. And Obama had to give he decided to tackle that straight on, and to give a speech in Philadelphia in March of 2008, in which he talks about race. He talks about this minister and so forth, but it's a sort of fence straddling talk. That is, okay, I want to talk to the concerns of white voters, and I want to talk to the concerns and the conditions of Black voters, and I'm more or less going to, sit here in the middle and do that, try to bring people together. So that, and then as soon as it's possible, I want to put this whole conversation aside and get back to issues that are not coded with race. His presidency, for the most part, is like that as well. You were mentioning the case of Henry Louis Gates, who is a Harvard professor who was arrested at his home. He got locked out of his home, and he climbed into a window or something, or forced the door. That's what they did. Forced the door, and one of his neighbors, who apparently did not know he lived there, I don't know how that happened, or couldn't see him well or something, called the police, and the police come, he does a perp walk and gets arrested and so forth. And Obama says that, he says the police acted stupidly. And that one word, that one sentence, he, up to that point, this was in 2009, summer of 2009, up to that point, he had enjoyed majority support from the white electorate. He's a new president. He came in very popular. After that phrase, that is it was Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Cambridge Police Department acted stupidly. He lost several points permanently among whites polled in every poll after that. He no longer had a majority of white support in every poll. And he learned the lesson, it was a very stark lesson to learn, that every word mattered. You don't, you can't say that kind of thing about law enforcement, even though policing and criminal justice in this country is problematic in all kinds of ways. In some communities, police have very high reputations, and you just can't say that sort of thing. So, and he's very careful in the future in regard to how he characterizes police, law enforcement, how he characterizes their actions, how he talks about race, and so forth. And he carries that about to the end of his presidency. In his second term, he's a bit more candid and talking about systemic racism and discrimination, and talking about the kinds of things he'd like to see done. Of course, by the second term, he's already lost the House, and then they lose the Senate, the Democrats, in the midterms of 2014. So there's really nothing that he can do but use the bully pulpit to talk about these things. It's not going to be any policy behind it because the Republicans were not playing ball with him. But he does talk about race in more, I think, forthcoming, candid ways by the last quarter of his presidency. Some of that is because he had to. There were the Black Lives Matter movement comes during his watch, and there are protests. You mentioned Trayvon Martin. There was other protests about the killing of unarmed African-American men and women by policemen and vigilantes and so forth. So he was forced to talk more about race and policing and criminal justice. But at the same time, I think that he wanted to, and also, to be fair about it, he felt it safer to do as well in the last years and months of his administration as well.
Yeah, I just want to give like a personal reflection on that speech that he gave about race. We're talking about regarding Jeremiah Wright and his affiliation with that church. I think people call it a more perfect union speech, if people want to Google it. That had a really strong impression on me or when I first read it, or maybe in the same year or shortly after that he delivered the remarks, because I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish world, and in my experience, there's a lot of beauty in that religious community, that religious life, and there's a lot of diversity, and there's all sorts of different people that participate, and there's also a lot of like bad things which get said. Bad is a very judgmental term. I don't think the things that Jeremiah Wright said criticizing America are necessarily so off base, but I'm saying from my perspective, from what I hear within my own religious world, I hear things that strike me as being really problematic, and then you're forced to grapple with this, where this is sort of part of your identity. It's part of, it's a home base in a lot of ways. It includes a big tent. It includes a lot of different types of people. And, to what extent is that a reflection of you, so that speech really resonated with me on that level as well. The religious valence of it. Moving on a little bit to adjacent topics here. Obama obviously received a lot of criticism from all across, from many different places. Some of the most interesting forms that criticism took were criticisms from the left. A person who I really respect tremendously, I feel like I learned a lot from, but I think you're fairly critical of in the book, is Dr. Cornel West, who was a intense critic of Obama. Does he sort of represent a kind of really strong criticism from the left that Obama's received?
Yes and no. I think if you look at the subset of critics on the left who found Obama problematic in some way or another, they are a vocal minority of people on the left. And especially if you look at the Black left, African Americans on the left. For the duration of President Obama's presidency, the entire 8 years, if you look at Gallup polls, and Gallup is pretty reputable as a polling site in regard to public opinion. Obama, only in 2 weeks of their polling in 8 years, dipped below 80% as far as African Americans are concerned, and the job approval that they accorded to President Obama. Just two weeks in 8 years, however many weeks that is, that's hundreds of weeks. Just 2 times that he'd fall below 80% among African Americans in regard to approval. If you just listen to some of the critics on the left, you'd think that every week he was dropping the ball and so forth. So I think that some of the critiques coming from this, again, I think small subset of folks are cogent critiques. I think when they criticize US policy in regard to what it does for the poor, or say that there was not enough done for all the people who lost their homes in the midst of this economic crisis, or that Obama and the Justice Department should have gone after all the crooks and rogues who sold all those bad mortgages to people. And many of those people should have been locked up for having done so instead of bailed out to the tune of trillions of dollars to these banks and corporations and so forth. Or the critiques of the use of drones, unarmed aircraft used for offensive purposes in different parts of the world, and people criticize Obama for using drones and so forth. I think those are legitimate critiques of the president. I think that there are some things that he simply could not do without the Congress, having a willing Congress. For example, he had a jobs bill that he wanted to pass, and he just did not have the votes in Congress to do that. He wanted to do more on criminal justice reform, just didn't have the votes to do that. He wanted to do more on the environment and tax policy, and there's a list on and on and on and on. So I think to criticize him for things that he wanted to do but weren't done because he did not have a willing partner in Congress, I don't think that that's a genuine criticism. But I do think to take him to task for his own policy prescriptions or policy preferences, and to say that he's not talking about the poor enough, or that he's not transparent enough in the way he's conducting foreign policy, especially this drone policy and military policy abroad and so forth. I think those are fair criticisms. Now, I think that some on the left, this sort of vocal Black left in particular, I think that some of the language was not productive. I think that some of it was personal stuff, and I think that some of that rhetoric was problematic and just counterproductive. The president of the United States, he's already busy enough. Do you need to be saying these personal things about him and these colorful remarks? He's not going to pay attention to that, and it's going to be counterproductive. You'll be even more marginalized because the president of the United States doesn't have time for it, and it's against the sort of general trend of support for the president. Most people in the Democratic Party, if you want to call that the left, and certainly most people among African Americans, are supportive of this president and not blaming him for where the country is during this time period. So the people on the margins who are sort of throwing these bombs at the president, saying he's not doing enough of this, they're already on the fringes of the left and fringes of the Democratic Party and so forth. They're even more on the fringe when they don't concede the kind of environment that Obama is in, and that environment is not conducive to him getting a lot done because of the gridlock in Congress and because of the sort of opposition, the sort of relentless opposition from conservatives and Republicans in Congress to everything that he wanted to get accomplished. So again, I think that some of his critics on the left have good arguments to make about the country not doing enough for the most vulnerable, for folks, people who lost their homes. There's not enough done in regard to urban policy and so forth. But I think that has to be tempered by the limits, as we were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation, the limits of executive power to get things done. He has the power of the executive order, but even that's a temporary, fleeting thing, and that can be overturned by the Congress anytime it wants to pass a bill that overturns an executive order. And then the next president coming in the door can overturn about every other executive order. So that's a temporary thing at best, the executive order. It's not real power like a bill passing through the Congress. So yeah, I'm sympathetic on the one hand with those on the left who had critiques. Sometimes they're very good critiques. I'm less sympathetic in regard to their misjudging his actual power or them taking him to task for not having a Black agenda. I think that was a very odd expectation, given that most of the folks who voted for him 2008 and 2012 were not Black. Most of the Democratic coalition is not Black. And to expect for that coalition to be behind Obama while he's privileging a subset of that coalition with targeted policies that help a subset of that coalition, I think it's probably a bridge too far. White voters tend to vote their self-interest like every other voter does. And to expect them to be in Obama's corner as he's targeting Black voters or Hispanic voters, or low-income voters with particular policies, while ignoring this larger coalition of folks who voted for you, is the path to losing the next election.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna say something which is on my mind, and if this doesn't go over, if it comes out sounding stupid, it's a chance I'll cut it out. But I'm reminded of a scene in a movie by Jordan Peele called Get Out, and in the movie, you have the Black kid visiting his white fiance's or white girlfriend's family in like the white suburban area, and the horror movie is that from his experience, he's the protagonist, he's a character that we're following. He's being walked into a horrifying world, a world of terror, a world that's gonna of cruelty towards him. And when he meets the father, he like gives this gesture of how much I totally understand you, and how much you're one of us. He says, I would have voted for Obama for a third term, and sort of the sense being that for white people, Obama was a very non-threatening president, and there's like this tendency maybe to sort of wear that on your sleeve as I'm so progressive. I don't know, just a scene that I don't fully understand maybe, but sticks with me.
Yeah, first of all, great movie.
Yeah.
I really like Get Out. I thought that's a good. It was strange in the best possible way strange can be. It's strange in a very sort of alluring way, the things he's trying to tackle in the movie. I think that Obama only works for a lot of people if they can connect, or they can think they're connecting. I think that angry Black man he understands does not work, is not a good look. And there are many times during his presidency that people, I heard people say, he ought to really get angry about that. He ought to speak his mind. He ought to tell these Republicans A, B, and C. And I just knew that wasn't going to happen. I knew that he didn't have that sort of latitude to, like a Trump. Trump can, he say whatever he wants, literally say whatever he wants to say, and he's not going to lose the core of his support. He can go after his opponents on gender and sexuality and race and immigration status. He just say anything. Obama he doesn't have that sort of latitude. Most politicians haven't, and certainly this Black guy is not going to have the kind of latitude that a white guy in the office has. He has to show himself, because we have, I think, in the national consciousness, there's an ideal about what a Black guy is and what a Black man will and will not do in a certain situation. And to make him a safe choice, he has to show himself to be non-threatening, very competent, a serious person in that position, well-trained or even overtrained for the position. And then, perhaps he's safe then. Obama understood that. I mean, he knew that script, and I think he followed that script pretty well. So I think that he works because he's following that script of the sort of safe guy, the competent guy, the guy with the Ivy League, degrees. He's a U.S. senator and so forth. He's vetted. He goes through the ranks, of he's not just any Black guy off the streets, and any Black guy off the streets can't become president. This guy was he was a Columbia grad, Harvard JD, and then he's a Illinois state senator, and then he's a U.S. senator, and then finally maybe we'll look at him as a presidential candidate. And he still has to comport himself in a certain kind of way, even though he has all these credentials and things. He writes books and everything. Lovely family, nuclear family, but he still has to, comport himself in a certain sort of way that's not like the stereotypical Black guy in the national consciousness of what the stereotypical Black guy is. And again, I think he's masterful at sort of walking that line. At the same time, with these sort of cultural gestures towards African Americans. I don't know if you remember, he's at the Apollo, and he did these, did a few refrains from an Al Green song, and at the funeral in 2015 of people who were killed in a church in Charleston, he did a eulogy, and he breaks out an Amazing Grace, so he's still pretty good at sort of this signifying of Black culture, African American culture, but that's not threatening. Amazing Grace is not threatening. Al Green is not threatening, right?
Yeah.
So I think he's really good at sort of walking the tightrope, and I have a chapter in the book called "Man on a Tightrope," and and that's a through line for the whole book. He's really good at sort of walking this high wire between sides, and keeping his balance for the most part, while doing so, while able to sort of signify to different groups that I'm one of you, or understand your culture, but in ways that are not threatening, and he's really good with doing that to African Americans. He's still smoothing with, sports figures and so forth, basketball players. He's a lifelong fan of basketball. So, but none of that's threatening or anything in regard to race. As he's sort of navigating things, and I think that his mastery of that, and the sort of signifying to young people, and coalition building among young people, and he was a fairly young person to be in the presidency too, so people can connect to him in that way as young kids in the House. So I think that he really masters that look and that sort of portrayal of himself in a way that a lot of white voters said, hey, this guy's one of us. It was a nuclear family. He's raising small kids. He went to Ivy League schools. He was a U.S. senator. His wife is a lawyer. That's apple pie, so as long as he, acts in a certain way, he can't afford to be angry Black guy. She can't afford to be angry Black woman. So again, there's still a litmus test that's going on in regard to, is this guy going to snap? Is he going to show us who he really is? At some point, and then things will fall apart and then people will say, "Oh, I told you so." He's just like the rest of them. So I think he's very conscious that his performance is just that, a performance, and that there are a lot of eyes on him, and he has to show himself as a fairly conventional American president, who just happens to be a Black guy too, as opposed to an African American president who just happens to be in the Oval Office.
Moving on a little bit in time, were you surprised by the election of Donald Trump?
Absolutely. Just like 99.99% of people in the world, I suppose. Yeah, I didn't see it coming. I think that, it's one of the great upsets in presidential elections, any elections in the history of this country. I think that in hindsight, and that's the one of the things that we historians, we very much depend on, that is we read the past with the hindsight of the present. I can see how it happened. I think that many of us observers of politics weren't reading what was right in front of us very well. I think that goes with the Obama administration. They thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. I think the Clinton people thought that she was going to win. I think the average person in this country thought that she was going to win. A lot of people probably sat out the election because they didn't think their vote mattered, because she was going to win. So I think that there was enough writing on the wall. I think the Clinton brand was very tarnished. I think people had a lot of Clinton fatigue going into 2016, whether it's people who remember the Clinton presidency of the 1990s and how sort of exhausting it was over time, with the back and forth between the president and his Republican enemies. And then she runs in 2008. then she's running again in 2016, and she was Secretary of State for Obama. I think there was a certain amount of Clinton fatigue that people had not fully understood by 2016. And I think that people did not really understand how canny a politician Trump turned out to be, how he had put his finger right on the pulse of about half of the electorate and spoke in a language that was easy to understand, direct. He didn't sugarcoat anything. It was nothing subtle. It was sound bites. It was build a wall. It was a Muslim ban. It was, he said out loud what a lot of people were thinking. And if there's a political genius to him, that's it. That is, he understood at that particular moment, you could put the dog whistle aside and you could actually take out the bullhorn. And you could say out loud what more or less Republicans were saying in more subtle ways and not so subtle ways about immigration. So the nativism that he taps into in regard to the southern border and Mexican immigration and so forth, that was already in the Republican Party. That was built in. The Islamophobia was already there. The suspicion of expertise and the elites and science and so forth, that was already swirling in the Republican Party. It wasn't something that just came out during the pandemic, that there was a good chunk of Americans who are suspicious of science or suspicious of experts or suspicious of elites and so forth. That was already there. He crystallizes this into a easy to understand, easy to digest message that's being peddled by a showman, and some would say a demigod. And people say, yeah, he's saying what I thought. Maybe this wall will fix our immigration. Maybe it's not amnesty. Maybe it's not immigration policy. We just need a big wall, right? That'll fix it. So it's simple solutions to complicated problems that he's offering people. And he's offering change. People say this election is a change election. This election might not. It was a change election. You had 8 years of Obama. Americans, their attention span for presidents tend not to go beyond 8 years, and sometimes it doesn't go beyond 4 years. They're tired of you after 4 years. But I think it was an election that a lot of people were not necessarily sold that Obama should get a third term through Hillary Clinton. That something was new, and maybe this guy who has never been a politician, and of course he sold himself as never being a politician, and he's something new, and I know business and I've run businesses and so forth. I can fix the economy. I alone can do it. It also speaks to an authoritarian strand in American politics, which has always been there. If we go back a few hundred years, the country starts with kings, right? It's colonies. They're ruled by a king, and there was a question about whether George Washington should be a king. And I think if he had declared himself King George Washington I, there'd been a lot of people who had been on board with that until something really bad happened, and they said, oh well, he was just like the other King George. Or how other presidents have comported themselves, especially during war times, and the kinds of powers that Abraham Lincoln and some others have had in wartime. So we've always had that sort of strongman, authoritarian strand in American history. The imperial presidency that comes out of Vietnam and the way it's conducted by Johnson and Nixon and so forth. I'm going to conduct foreign policy. I'm going to wage war. I'm not going to let Congress and the American people know what I'm doing. I'm going to have these bloated budgets and everything. So that sort of kingly presidency is not strange to this country. And it's one way of understanding our current moment. That is, it may seem surprising to some who would say, hey, how is a Trump possible? This guy's breaking all the rules. Is this guy who's trying to shake down foreign leaders and get favors out of them. This guy is weaponizing the Justice Department and telling his attorney general to go after this person, arrest this person, and lock this person up. How is that possible? But it speaks to a larger, I think, phenomena in not only American history, but also our contemporary world, in which people are not seeing the kinds of results coming out of a democratic system and fast enough results to solve problems. And they are susceptible to this idea of, okay, do away with the press, do away with Congress, do away with the courts, and see what this guy, and it's almost always a guy, see what this guy can get done, who's promising all these things, see what he can get done. And I think that even though Trump is a former president, if he were to run for office again, he would be the candidate for the Republican Party, and he may even have a decent chance of becoming the next president. So that lingers, this hunger for the strong man, the guy who's going to come in and just do his thing, the guy who's going to bend the rules, to break the rules, and do it in the name of making us great again, right? Do it in the name of simple solutions to complicated problems. So back, long-winded way to get at your original question. Did I see Trump coming? No, I didn't. I thought this was Hillary Clinton's. I thought she had it in the bag and so forth. Now in hindsight, do I see how he was possible? I do. I do see how he was possible.
And that was one of the big shocks for also a lot of people, is the fact that all the things that the people like me, people on the left, saw as like Trump's weaknesses, for example, is like obvious lies, like just obvious lying about the littlest, most petty things, the size of his inauguration crowd, just obscene things, his conspiracy theories. People like me, people on the left see it as like, oh, it's a weakness of the candidate. But I think those turned out to be his strengths. I think for a large amount of people, the truth, some sort of allegiance to truth, some sort of allegiance to fact, allegiance to expertise got us here, and if we want freedom, if we want to break free, if we want to create a new, a better situation, then let's jettison all that, let's just embrace the lies, let's construct our own fiction and call that reality. And because of course, so much more is possible. When you lie, you can call into question the results of a fair election and say it was rigged, and that's very, very powerful. I think to any analogies to Nazi Germany, when the Germans, even German soldiers, people high up in the German commanders, that we didn't know. And then at Nuremberg and different cities, had you not known, because the media was fake news, it was propaganda, the foreign media. How can we trust the foreign media? So when you're willing to, call reality fake, like anything becomes possible, and what's terrifying is that it seems that a lot of people are tempted by that. That's an attractive timeline for them.
Yeah, and I think this particular moment in which people get their news from all kinds of places, so a lot of people get their news, they never turn on television. It's all Facebook and social media and Twitter and the internet and so forth. They don't look at television anymore, or it's only one station. It's only Fox News, or it's only MSNBC, and whatever else is going on that they don't get their news from. So when you have so many segments of the population, they're getting their news, and they're, as you're saying, they're versions of reality, because the news is not an objective thing. That is, the people who broadcast the news, they're making very subjective judgments about what they cover. So we're going to do 5 minutes of this, we're going to do 2 minutes of that, and we're going to do 3 minutes of that, and so forth. Those are judgments to cover certain things and not to cover other things. So the idea of the news is a judgment, often a political judgment in regard to what we cover and what the station thinks of as the news. So I think that allows, more easily allows what you just said, but for people to sort of have a smorgasbord of what reality is. I'll take a little of this and a little of that, and I'll watch a little of this, and I'll post a little of that on social media, and I'll follow this person, but not this person. So people are putting together, what is real and what is reality, and what sources are credible and what sources are not credible. So when everyone has that sort of freedom to do that, of course, you're going to get a very fragmented national sense of what's real or what's legitimate when people have the power to sort of do this on their own. I think also that there is a meta picture to this. I think that Trump makes sense against the backlash of what people believed Obama was about, this sort of demographically changing America, this America that some people just think is just not traditional America enough. An America in which a Black guy can become president, an America in which a Black woman can become vice president, and an America that has a pretty large immigrant population, and so Trump is a reaction to that. He's a very self-conscious reaction to that. When he says build the wall and start mass deportations and putting kids in cages and that sort of thing, he's speaking in a and not even in a subtle way. He's speaking in a very, I think, explicit way about race and what the country is becoming demographically. When he calls countries in Africa S-hole countries and says, why are we letting people in from those countries? We should let more people in from Norway. Well, that's not a subtle way of saying we need to let more white folks in this country from Norway, which is like 95% white or something like that, as opposed to letting people in from Africa or Asia and so forth. So I think that he gets a pass on a lot of the other stuff. And some of the stuff is just really crazy stuff because people take him. There's a saying during the campaign 2016 that people on the left, the Democrats, take Trump literally, but they don't take him seriously. So when he says he's going to build the wall and Mexicans are going to pay for it and so forth, they took it literally. Although they didn't take it seriously, nobody believed that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. But they went after him saying, "Look, he's a racist, and he's saying this about Mexico, and what are we going to do about it?" His own supporters, however, and I think this is absolutely true, people said that they don't take him literally, but they take him seriously. Well, maybe Mexico won't pay for the wall. Okay, maybe we won't even get the whole wall. But the gist of it is that we need to keep these folks out of the country, and he's down for that, Trump. Whether it's paying for a wall or it's some kind of other policy, we take him seriously that he's trying to keep these brown folks from Mexico from coming here. We take that seriously. However he manages to do it, whether we can take the wall, that specific thing seriously, the sentiment behind it we take seriously.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the major ways of understanding his enduring appeal on the right is to understand this sort of meta picture that he wants to slow the demographic change in this country, and get back to this traditional America, whatever that looks like, whether it's 1950s or whatever, and which it was no question about who ran the country and who was in a privileged position in the country and so forth. Even if we have to turn back the clock, and even if we have to do damage to American institutions, even if we have to have an insurrection, willing to do that if if it means halting the sort of demographic change that's going on in this country that a lot of folks on the right think is problematic, and he's their man for doing so. Even if you don't take him literally about how he's going to get it done, you take him seriously in regard to the sentiment that this needs to be done.
Yeah, I remember a headline in the Atlantic shortly after the election where Trump is the first white president, and I think that's really astute. And regarding, I think everything, not everything, but so much of his rhetoric and what he does is about stemming demographic change. And the larger picture is not just to the extent that you can't stem demographic change, you want to stem democratic institutions. You want to stem democracy, because demographic change means, an empowering of the majority, or an empowering of empowering of minorities in a majority minority country, for example. And to prevent that change, you have to sabotage. You have to really destroy democracy, and I think that's very much what we've what the insurrection, for example, was about, and what a lot of Trump's presidency was about.
I think that's you put your finger on my own personal concern as an American about my country. Over the next, ideally we'll be alive long enough to see what's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 decades, but you put your finger right on my concern. That is the fear of more or less multicultural pluralism, which is what you're talking about. That is a majority minority country, a democratic multicultural, democratic small d, multicultural pluralism. Is the fear of that great enough a fear among enough people to overturn the whole experiment in democratic governance, small d democratic governance in this country, is the fear of this sort of multicultural majority coming into being, and what that means for democracy in America and power relations and so forth between groups. Is that fear an ingrained enough fear and a widespread enough fear that we'll have a large number or critical mass of our fellow countrymen and countrywomen to take up arms, or to be okay with the destruction of institutions, starting with the Capitol, in the name of reserving for themselves some sort of privilege, some sort of notion of yesteryear's arrangements. I don't know the questions, an answer to that. I hope I'm optimistic. I'd like to say that, you know, the forces that would want to see an overturning of the entire table are not enough in number, in commitment to do that. But I'm not convinced of that yet. I'm optimistic that good people across the board will come together and fix whatever needs to be fixed. And there are a lot of things that need to be fixed about our electoral system and so forth, and our class system and inequalities of all sorts and so forth. There's a lot that needs to be fixed. I don't think that a dictatorship is, you know, or an authoritarian setup is going to fix it. And I don't think that whoever the next strong man that comes after Trump, there'll be others, and says, I alone can fix it. You know, just give me the power, give me the reins and so forth. The world is packed with these kinds of guys, whether it's Putin, whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil and so forth. So these guys are a dime a dozen, and in 20th century and world history. So whoever comes after Trump, I'm hoping that we've turned the corner enough that stuff doesn't sell as well, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Again, that's my concern, that there's a critical mass of folks out there who just see the world burn and the country burn, than to abide by letting democracy play itself out.
Yeah. And I'm 100% on the same page. And I've been thinking a lot about these questions of democracy recently, and the ways in which democracy is obviously fragile and hard, because it relies on regular people, you know, being alarmed or being informed or seeing it as something to preserve. And, you know, regular people, you know, everyone has their own sort of bubble of people that they know. So in my little bubble of people that I know, you know, there's so many people who just are worried about their life and worried about, and they don't know, you know, they don't understand necessarily all the details of, you know, any particular election or the stakes of a Supreme Court seat, you know, whatever that might be. And it's scary. It's scary because it's fragile, I guess. And you sort of see the fragility when you talk to, you know, when you talk to any voters, I guess. It's a fragile system. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you only see that when it's under duress.
Yeah.
I think if you ask, you know, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, if you asked me 5 years ago, would thousands of my fellow countrymen go to the Capitol and break into place and look to hang the Vice President of the United States and build a gallows to hang him with, and the President of the United States would egg it on? No, I didn't think it could happen here.
Yeah.
And I think that's the exact, Amakai, I think that's the exact problem. That is, maybe we Americans are too smug. And we don't, you know, this thing has lasted a long time. This experiment in American constitutionalism and democracy has lasted since the 18th century. It's had some bumps and ups and downs, but for the most part, it's held, and democracy has expanded. It's embraced more and more people over the last couple of centuries. So I think that we have been lulled into a sense that this thing is too durable, and too institutionalized and too ingrained. But you're exactly right. If you look at democracy in every other part of the world, it's often fleeting, it's incomplete, It's fragile. It needs just a little nudge to fall off a cliff or to be broken. And I think that that's the lesson of the last 5 years, the fragility. There are a lot of blind spots in our system. Just looking at the current drama, the Congress can't get people to come in by way of subpoena to even talk about an insurrection that they may have helped inspire. That's tied up in the courts. So there's a lot of blind spots just in regard to investigating an attempt to overthrow a constitutional system. We can't even get a good investigation of that. Or investigating is like pulling teeth just to get people to come and talk to the Congress. So I think that's the big lesson, that this American exceptionalism thing, we're maybe not all that exceptional in regard to what can happen here. If it can happen, in advanced countries around the world. You mentioned the German instance. Who thought that Germany would try to exterminate its Jewish population? Maybe Russia, right? Authoritarian Russia. Maybe the czars would do something with all the pogroms. Who thought an advanced country like Germany would do what it did? But it happened there. So I think that's the lesson of the last 5 years. This is a fragile thing. It has a lot of blind spots in it. There are a lot of people who don't believe in it, and will allow for a leader to emerge who bends all the rules, because they don't think that the system itself is one above reproach. So yeah. Again, you put your finger on my own concerns.
Yeah. We're basically getting to the end here. It's been a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversation, which I really appreciate and I really, really have enjoyed. It seems like we're probably not going to end on such a hopeful note, but that's okay. I guess the last thought I just maybe have been thinking about based on this conversation is that it's tempting to see Trump as such a break, such a anomalous character, and of course in many ways he is. But one of the things that comes across in the book is sort of the continuities, from the Obama years. And so, Justice Scalia is someone who has such in my world, such a positive reputation. Someone he was friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, apparently, according to news reports, and people who consider themselves moderates saw him as like such an eloquent, funny, religious guy. And in his Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, he was part of the vote that gutted the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights, the part of the Voting Rights Act, which was instrumental in preventing voter suppression. And it's that decision which you could trace the line to voter suppression tactics that may have swung swing states in the direction of Trump. And those are the same exact techniques. After Justice Scalia died, the Republicans didn't refuse to fill the seat of the Supreme Court. All these things. So there is this continuity. It's not coming out of nowhere. There is this history, in recent history, in the past 10 years of this kind of repression of democracy. And so that's the fight that we're still seeing persist today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's even beyond the last 5 to 10 years. We saw some of that during the 60s, the Republican Party trying to discourage Black voters in urban areas in particular from voting. In the 80s too, and actually there was a consent decree that the Republicans had to abide by that said that you can't put billboards in Black communities about discouraging people to vote. You can't use some of these tactics to suppress the vote. And that was lifted in recent years. But the big thing, as you mentioned, Amakai, was the gutting of the voting rights bill in 2013 by the Supreme Court and the protections that it allowed, so that states couldn't just, state legislatures couldn't just up and say, okay, we're gonna make it harder for people to vote because we're going to close down the DMVs and where people get licenses, and we're going to force people to have photo IDs, but make it harder for them to get photo IDs because we're not going to fund the DMV, or we're going to do all these other things that we're seeing today, and make it harder for people to cast ballots remotely or through the mails. We're going to take up the ballot collection boxes, and you know, there's some places talking about having a citizenship test. You have to prove you're a citizen, and that goes even beyond just showing up with a driver's license. Yeah, the doors open by the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and at one time the Voting Rights Act, it has to be approved every 25 years. So at one time that was just, they just did it, and the Republicans and Democrats just sort of did it. You know, they would vote and support the renewal of the act, but by the time we get to the Holder or the Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013, is very partisan, and as it is now. Voting rights, voting policy, and so forth is very partisan. So you have states that are run by Republicans that make it hard to vote, and states run by Democrats that are, if they're doing anything on voting rights, they're trying to make it easier to vote. And that goes back to what we were saying before, this sort of fear of a multicultural, democratic, small d pluralism, that if you let democracy just play it out, you're going to have a situation in which Black voters and brown voters and people of color have an increasing say in the national conversation, in the state and local conversations when it comes to voting and balloting over time. And there's a genuine fear of what that means, especially coming from the Republican Party. So all of what you touched on earlier in regard to casting aspersions on the elections that one doesn't win. You know, my side must win, right? And if my side didn't win, then it was rigged. It was, you know, you had dead people voting, or people voted several times in the system is fraudulent, which is, as the narrative that comes out of the 2020 election from Trump is. If I don't win, if my side doesn't win, then it must be that the system is messed up. And let's fix the system by making it even harder for voters to vote, especially voters that, you know, come from different demographic groups, urban voters, poor people who vote and tend to, for the most part, vote for Democrats and so forth. We'll make it harder. And that's how we improve the system. Even though we don't have any evidence to show that there's all this fraud, we're gonna still, just in case there is any fraud, we're gonna make it harder for people to vote, and which I think even more erodes the faith of people in the system. So if you have a system in which people on all sides of the spectrum think the system is fraudulent, that historically has led to a certain kind of outcome for democracy. So when you have a critical mass of people who think it doesn't work, and then someone raises their hand and says, "I alone can fix it," you know, that's a movie we've seen before.
Yeah. It's not the most hopeful note to end on, but I think that's okay. I think it's people, we should be realistic, and if people are alarmed, then there's times when it's okay to be alarmed. Dr. Clegg, this has been so great, so wonderful. Your book was a wonderful read or listening experience, as the case might be in my case, and I'm really grateful for you sharing your time with me today. Is there anything you want to just end off with? People can find you maybe, or find the book or anything.
Sure. The book, The Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama, it's available anywhere books are sold. Amazon's, of course, a good place to get it. You can get it straight from the publisher, Johns Hopkins University Press. Their website is press.jhu.edu. And again, you know, any other place that you buy books, they can order it for you and so forth if it's not in stock. So yeah, thank you for your time and your great questions. Again, I you know, sometimes, you know, these are complicated things, and sometimes there's not a happy ending to things. And again, we don't know what the ending is, but thanks for unpacking with me some of the things that the book is about, and certainly some of the things that are going on now in our political culture that we all should be concerned about.